Outlaws threaten a 93-year-old woman's farm until her Navy SEAL grandson arrives. The early morning sun bathed the Bell family farm in a soft golden light. Rows of corn swayed gently in the breeze, and the distant cluck of chickens broke the quiet stillness. Clara Bell, 93 years old but sharp as ever, stood on her porch with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She gazed out over the land she and her late husband had spent decades nurturing. This farm was her legacy, a testament to their hard work and resilience, but something wasn't right. The horizon wasn't the only thing casting shadows today. Clara's usually dependable farmhand, Mason, had quit the day before, muttering something about not wanting trouble. And there had been the strange black truck parked on the road 2 nights ago. Its headlights off, but its presence impossible to ignore. Clara set her coffee down, her weathered hands steady despite the unease bubbling in her chest. She had lived through wars, droughts, and heartbreak. Whatever was coming, she would face it head-on. Mid-morning brought more than the usual chores. The sound of engines broke the quiet, growing louder until 3 dust-covered trucks pulled into the driveway. Clara stepped out onto the porch. Her posture as straight as her frail frame allowed. The trucks came to a halt, and 6 men climbed out. They weren't from around here, that much was clear. Their clothes were rugged but too clean, their boots too new, and their eyes carried a dangerous gleam. Leading the group was a tall man in his late 40s, with a cowboy hat tilted over piercing gray eyes. He carried himself like someone used to getting what he wanted. "Morning, ma'am," the man said, tipping his hat slightly. His voice was smooth, but the undercurrent of menace was impossible to miss. "Name's Elias Cole. I was hoping we could have a chat." Clara crossed her arms. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." Elias chuckled, stepping onto the porch. "It's not about buying, ma'am. It's about selling. Your land. To be specific." Clara's eyes narrowed. "This land isn't for sale." Elias smirked, gesturing toward the sprawling fields. "You've got a beautiful place here. Shame if anything were to happen to it." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Clara didn't flinch. "You don't scare me, Mr. Cole. Now, get off my property before I call the sheriff." Elias's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "I'll be back, ma'am, and when I come back, it won't just be to talk. Think about what's best for you, for this land." With that, he turned and walked back to his truck, his men following. The engines roared to life, and the convoy disappeared down the road, leaving behind a cloud of dust and tension. Clara sat in her kitchen, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She could feel the weight of Elias's words pressing down on her. She didn't doubt he'd make good on his threats. Men like him always did, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not ever. Her gaze drifted to the small photograph on the wall, her grandson, Jack, in his Navy SEAL uniform, standing tall and proud. It had been years since he left the farm for the military, and though they stayed in touch, his visits had grown infrequent. Still, she knew he would come if she called, and right now, she needed him. Clara picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number she had memorized long ago. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Jack Bell?" Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Jack, it's Grandma." The warmth in his voice was immediate. "Grandma, it's good to hear your voice. How are you?" "I've been better," she admitted, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her chest. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jack's tone grew serious. "What's going on?" Clara told him everything. The visit from Elias, the threats, and the ominous feeling that had settled over the farm. She kept her tone even, not wanting to sound weak, but she didn't downplay the danger. By the time she finished, Jack's voice was firm. "I'll be there by tomorrow. Don't worry. Grandma, we'll handle this." For the first time that day, Clara allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you, Jack. You're the only one I trust with this. I'll see you soon," Jack said before hanging up. Clara set the phone down, her resolve hardening. Elias Cole might think he could bully her into submission, but he had underestimated her family. She wasn't just a farmer, she was a fighter. and her grandson was about to show Elias exactly what that meant as the sun set over the farm. Clara stood on the porch once more, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The golden light faded into darkness, but she felt a flicker of hope. Her Navy SEAL grandson was coming home, and the fight was just beginning. The drive from the coast to Reed Ridge was long, but Jack Bell didn't mind. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, his sharp blue eyes focused on the road ahead. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, barren yet strangely calming. Jack had always been at ease in the quiet, an odd comfort born from years of chaos in the Navy SEALs. But today, the silence didn't soothe him. His mind was racing. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. She had sounded calm, but he knew her too well. Clara Bell was tough, tougher than anyone he'd ever known. But if she'd called for help, the situation was serious. Jack reached into the cup holder for his thermos, sipping the lukewarm coffee as he replayed her words. A man named Elias Cole was threatening her, trying to force her to sell the farm. Jack didn't need details to know the type. He'd dealt with bullies like that before, men who thought power came from fear. But this wasn't just any fight. This was personal. It was late afternoon when the familiar silhouette of the Bell family farm came into view. The sight brought a wave of nostalgia and a pang of guilt. He hadn't been back in nearly 2 years, caught up in his transition to civilian life and trying to find his footing after the military. But now that he was here, the memories came flooding back, running through the fields as a boy, helping his grandfather repair the barn, and sitting on the porch with Clara, listening to her stories. Jack pulled into the gravel driveway, his truck kicking up a small cloud of dust. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the ground. The farm looked just as he remembered, sturdy and full of life. But there was something different, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "Jack?" Clara's voice called from the porch. He turned to see her standing there, a smile spreading across her weathered face. She looked as strong as ever, her eyes twinkling with pride despite the worry she was clearly carrying. Jack strode up the steps and wrapped her in a gentle hug. "Grandma," he said, his voice soft, "it's good to see you." She held him tightly for a moment before pulling back, her hands on his shoulders. "You're a sight for sore eyes, Jack. I'm glad you came." "Of course I came," he said, stepping inside with her. "You called," I answered. "Now tell me everything." Over a simple dinner at the kitchen table, Clara laid out the situation in detail. Elias Cole wasn't just some local thug. He was the head of a gang that had been operating in the region for years, intimidating farmers and small businesses to give up their land or pay protection money. Clara's farm was their latest target, and Elias had made it clear that he wouldn't take no for an answer. "He said he'd be back," Clara said, her voice steady. "And I believe him." Jack leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. He picked the wrong farm. Clara smiled faintly, her hand resting on his. "Jack, I know you've been through a lot. I don't want you to feel like you have to fight my battles. This isn't just your battle," Jack said firmly. "This farm is our family's legacy. It's where I grew up, where Grandpa taught me everything I know about hard work and standing your ground. No one is taking it from us." Clara's eyes glistened with pride. "Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." Jack nodded, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "We'll get through this, Grandma. I promise." That night, Jack walked the perimeter of the farm. Alpha, a German shepherd he had adopted after his service, trotting faithfully at his side. The stars were bright above, the only witnesses to the silent vigil. Jack inspected the fences, the outbuildings, and the surrounding fields, his trained eye cataloging every detail. He wasn't just reacquainting himself with the land. He was assessing its vulnerabilities. He crouched near the barn, running his hand along a fence post. "What do you think, Alpha?" he murmured. The dog perked his ears, sniffing the air. Jack smiled. "Yeah, me too. We've got some work to do." The next morning, Jack set to work. He started with the basics, reinforcing the fences, repairing weak spots in the barn, and clearing sightlines around the property. Clara watched from the porch, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and concern. "You're turning this place into a fortress," she remarked as Jack hauled a stack of lumber toward the back fence. "Not a fortress," Jack replied, wiping sweat from his brow. A stronghold. There's a difference. Clara chuckled softly but didn't argue by midday. Jack had finished the first round of reinforcements. He sat on the porch with Clara, a glass of iced tea in his hand. "I'm going to need supplies," he said. "Tools, cameras, maybe a few surprises for our visitors." "There's a hardware store in town," Clara said. "But be careful. If Elias has people there, they'll notice you." Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I hope they do." Jack drove into Reed Ridge that afternoon, Alpha sitting alertly in the passenger seat. The town was quiet, its streets lined with small businesses and weathered homes. It had changed since his childhood, but not by much. Jack parked outside the hardware store and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of sawdust and oil as he gathered supplies. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He caught glimpses of men loitering on street corners, their eyes following him as he loaded his truck. Jack didn't react, but the tension in his chest tightened. He wanted them to know he was here, but on his terms. By the time Jack returned to the farm, the sun was beginning to set. He unloaded the supplies and began setting up the first wave of defenses: motion-detecting lights, reinforced locks, and cameras mounted at strategic points. Alpha followed him closely, as if sensing the importance of their work as the last light of day faded. Jack stood on the porch with Clara, the farm bathed in the soft glow of the newly installed lights. "They'll come," Clara said quietly. Jack nodded. "Let them." In the distance, the faint sound of engines echoed across the desert. The fight was coming, and Jack Bell was ready. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles just before the first sign of trouble. Jack Bell stood on the front porch of the farmhouse, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. His eyes scanned the horizon, his instincts honed from years as a Navy SEAL keeping him on high alert. Alpha sat at his side, the dog's ears perked, his sharp gaze fixed on the same distant point. "Looks like it's holding," Jack muttered, glancing at the motion-activated lights now illuminating the perimeter of the farm. "At least for now." Behind him, the door creaked open, and Clara Bell stepped out, a light shawl draped over her shoulders. "You've been at it all day," she said softly. "You should rest." Jack shook his head, his focus never leaving the fields. "Not yet. They'll come, Grandma. Men like Elias don't back down just because we're ready." Clara moved beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his broad shoulders. She followed his gaze, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing," she said with a faint smile. "He'd stay up all night watching over the farm when he thought something was amiss. Stubborn, just like you." Jack's lips twitched, though his tone remained serious. "He taught me well." The next morning, Jack woke before dawn, the faint light of the rising sun casting long shadows across the land. He slipped into his boots and grabbed a cup of coffee before heading out to continue his work. The farm needed to be more than a place to live. It had to be a defensible stronghold. His first stop was the barn, where he had stored the supplies he'd picked up in town. Motion sensors, floodlights, tripwire alarms, everything he needed to ensure the farm was ready for whatever Elias and his men threw at them. Jack worked methodically, installing the devices and reinforcing weak points in the fences and doors as he worked. Clara appeared with a tray of sandwiches and lemonade. "You can't fight on an empty stomach," she said, setting the tray on a nearby hay bale. Jack chuckled, taking a sandwich. "Thanks, Grandma, but this isn't fighting, it's preparing." Clara sat on an overturned bucket, watching him with a mix of admiration and concern. "You've been preparing for a fight your whole life, Jack. I just hope this one doesn't cost you more than it's worth." "It won't," Jack said firmly. "I'm not just fighting for the farm, I'm fighting for you, for what this place means." Clara reached out and squeezed his hand. "I know, and that's what worries me." By midday, Jack had completed the first phase of his plan. The farm was now outfitted with hidden cameras covering every approach, reinforced gates at key access points, and an alarm system that would alert him to any movement. Alpha roamed the property, his keen nose sniffing for signs of trouble. Jack stepped back, surveying his work. "Not bad," he muttered. "Now we just wait." But Jack wasn't the kind of man to sit idle. He spent the rest of the afternoon setting traps, simple but effective measures designed to slow down anyone foolish enough to step foot on the property uninvited. Pressure-activated noisemakers, concealed pits, and even a few surprises inspired by his SEAL training as the sun dipped below the horizon. Clara called Jack in for dinner. The farmhouse was warm and inviting, the scent of roast chicken filling the air. For a moment, Jack allowed himself to relax, the familiar comfort of home easing the tension in his shoulders. "This feels good," Clara said as they ate. "Having you here again. It's been too long." Jack nodded, his expression softening. "I missed this place." "Missed you?" Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Jack paused, his fork hovering over his plate. He thought of the missions, the losses, the nights spent wondering if he'd ever come home. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but this, being here, it feels right." Before Clara could respond, Alpha let out a low growl from the corner of the room. Jack's head snapped up, his body tensing. The dog's ears were pinned back, his sharp eyes fixed on the front door. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked. Rising from his seat, Clara stood as well, her face pale. "You think it's them?" Jack didn't answer. He grabbed his rifle from the corner and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The motion-activated lights cast long shadows across the yard, but everything seemed still. "Stay here," he said, his voice low, "and lock the door behind me." Clara hesitated, then nodded, her hands trembling as she turned the lock. Jack stepped out onto the porch, his rifle at the ready. Alpha followed close behind, his growl deep and steady. Jack scanned the perimeter, his sharp eyes searching for movement. For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the fields. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a faint glint of light, the reflection of a headlight. Someone was parked just beyond the property line. Watching, Jack's jaw tightened. He raised his rifle, its scope zeroing in on the vehicle. He couldn't make out faces, but the silhouette of a figure in the driver's seat was clear. "They're testing us," he muttered, "seeing if we're ready." Alpha barked once, the sound sharp and commanding. The truck's engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped away, disappearing into the night. Jack lowered his rifle, his expression hard. "Let them run. Next time, they won't get the chance." Back inside, Clara waited anxiously by the window. When Jack returned, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "They were out there, weren't they?" she asked. Jack nodded, his voice steady. "They're watching, testing our defenses. What do we do now?" Jack looked at her, his determination unwavering. "Now, we let them make their move, and when they do, we'll be ready." As the clock struck midnight, the farm fell quiet once more, but the tension in the air remained. An unspoken promise that the battle was far from over. The sun had barely risen when Clara Belle woke to the sound of Jack hammering planks onto the front gate. She stood on the porch, clutching a steaming cup of coffee, watching as her grandson worked with the precision of a man who had done this 100 times before. Jack moved with purpose, his muscles flexing as he secured the final reinforcements to the gate. "You've been up all night?" Clara called, her voice carrying a mix of pride and concern. Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, climbing down from the ladder. "Figured I'd make sure the gate holds." Clara smiled faintly, though her worry lingered. "You're too much like your grandfather." Jack chuckled softly. "So I've been told." By mid-morning, the farm was bustling with quiet preparations. Jack checked the cameras, fine-tuned the alarm system, and walked the perimeter with Alpha, ensuring everything was in place. Clara stayed busy in the kitchen, preparing lunch, though the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air as the clock struck noon. The distant growl of engines shattered the calm. "They're back?" Jack muttered, his sharp eyes narrowing as he stepped onto the porch. Alpha let out a low growl, his body tense. Clara appeared beside him, her hands tightening around the edges of her apron. "What do we do?" "Stay here," Jack said firmly. "I'll handle this." 3 trucks rolled into the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust as they came to a stop. The doors swung open, and a dozen men stepped out, each armed with rifles slung over their shoulders. At the center of the group was Elias Cole, his cowboy hat tilted low, a smug grin on his face. "Afternoon, Mrs. Bell," Elias called, his tone oozing false charm. "Thought we'd stop by for another chat." Jack stepped forward, placing himself between the men and the farmhouse. His stance was calm but commanding, the kind that made it clear he was not to be trifled with. "You've had your chat," Jack said, his voice steady. "Time to leave." Elias raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "And you are?" "Jack Bell," he replied. "Her grandson." Recognition flickered in Elias's eyes, but he didn't waver. "Ah, the Navy SEAL. Heard about you. Figured you'd come running once you got wind of our little visit." Jack didn't respond. His gaze locked on Elias. Elias took a step closer, spreading his arms in a mock display of innocence. "Now, listen, I don't want any trouble. Just here to make a fair deal. Mrs. Bell sells the farm. We walk away, and everyone's happy." Jack's jaw tightened. "The farm's not for sale." Elias's smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. "That's a shame. You see, I don't take no for an answer." Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "You're not taking this farm. Not today. Not ever." The tension was thick as Elias and Jack stared each other down, the outlaws shifting uneasily behind their leader. One of the men, younger and jittery, stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Maybe we should teach him some manners, boss," the man said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Jack moved before anyone could blink. In one swift motion, he disarmed the man, twisting his arm and forcing him to the ground. The outlaw cried out in pain as Jack pressed a knee into his back, the confiscated gun now pointed at Elias. "I suggest you keep your men on a shorter leash," Jack said coldly. Elias raised his hands, feigning calm. "Easy. Now, no need to get violent." Jack didn't lower the gun. "I'll say this once. Get off this property and don't come back." Elias stared at him for a long moment, then signaled to his men. "Let him go. Boys, we've made our point." Jack released the man, who scrambled to his feet and backed away. His face pale. Elias tipped his hat, his smirk returning. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But this isn't over. We'll be back. And when we come, it won't just be for a chat." Jack watched as the trucks roared to life and disappeared down the driveway, the threat hanging in the air like smoke back in the kitchen. Clara paced nervously as Jack cleaned his rifle at the table. "That man's dangerous, Jack. You saw the look in his eyes." "I saw it," Jack said, his voice calm. "But so is desperation. Men like Elias don't walk away unless you make them." Clara sat across from him, her hands wringing. "I don't want this to turn into a war." Jack met her gaze, his expression serious. "It's already a war, Grandma. The only question is whether we fight it on our terms or theirs." That evening, Jack worked tirelessly to bolster the farm's defenses. He set additional traps around the perimeter, reinforced the barn doors, and placed hidden sensors near the driveway. Alpha followed him closely, the dog's sharp instincts an invaluable asset as night fell. Jack stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The farm was as secure as he could make it, but he knew it wouldn't stop Elias and his men. They would come back, and when they did, it wouldn't just be a show of force. It would be an all-out assault. Clara joined him, her presence a quiet comfort. "You've done everything you can, Jack. Now we just have to pray it's enough." Jack nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It will be." The distant sound of coyotes echoed through the night, a haunting reminder of the dangers lurking in the shadows. But Jack stood firm, his determination unshaken. The farm was ready, and so was he. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the Bell family farm in soft gold. But for Jack Bell, the beauty of the morning was lost amid the weight of preparation. He had no illusions about what was coming. Elias Cole and his men wouldn't back down after their humiliation. They'd return, and this time, they wouldn't hold back. The farmhouse kitchen was a hive of quiet activity. Clara brewed a fresh pot of coffee, her movements calm but deliberate, while Jack spread out a map of the property on the dining table. His SEAL instincts were in full effect as he reviewed every detail of the farm, marking weak points and planning contingencies. "You really think they'll come back so soon?" Clara asked, setting a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. They won't wait long, Jack replied, his voice steady. They'll want to hit us before we're ready. Clara gave him a small smile, her pride shining through despite her worry. They don't know who they're dealing with. Jack's lips twitched into a faint grin. They're about to find out. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Jack began by fortifying the farmhouse itself, turning it into a last line of defense. Windows were reinforced with wooden boards, and heavy furniture was repositioned to provide cover. Clara helped where she could, her determination unwavering despite her age. Jack then moved on to the barn and surrounding fields, setting up traps and alarms designed to slow the outlaws down. He placed tripwires connected to cans filled with rocks, pressure-activated noisemakers, and even a few makeshift spike strips hidden in the tall grass. Alpha followed him everywhere, the dog's sharp nose and keen instincts a constant asset. By midday, Jack realized he couldn't do it all alone. He needed help. With Clara's blessing, he drove into town to gather allies among the neighbors who had long been friends to the Bell family. At the mechanic's garage, Jack found Tommy Bishop, a burly man with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold. Elias's men? Tommy said when Jack explained the situation. Those bastards have been bothering everyone around here. Count me in. Next, Jack visited Sheriff Davis, the retired lawman who had once mentored him as a boy. The older man leaned back in his chair, his weathered face contemplative. I can't get involved officially, Davis said, but I'll make some calls. Let me see what I can do. Finally, Jack stopped by the veterinary clinic, where Clara's friend, Maggie Wright, was tending to a wounded dog. Maggie, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, offered her support without hesitation. They've been causing trouble for too long, she said. I'll help however I can. By the time Jack returned to the farm, he wasn't alone. Tommy brought tools and spare parts to help reinforce the vehicles and equipment. Maggie arrived with medical supplies, her sharp eyes assessing the situation with the precision of a seasoned professional. Sheriff Davis didn't come himself, but a few deputies stopped by with ammunition and a quiet nod of solidarity. Clara stood on the porch, watching the small but determined group as they worked. This is more than I ever expected, she said softly. Jack joined her, his voice low but resolute. People don't like bullies, Grandma, and they're not just fighting for us, they're fighting for the town. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the farm transformed into a fortress. The barn was fortified with reinforced doors and firing positions. The fields were riddled with hidden traps and alarms, and the farmhouse itself was ready to withstand an assault. With defensible positions at every window, Jack gathered everyone on the porch as the last rays of sunlight faded. Thank you all for being here, he said, his voice carrying the weight of leadership. Elias and his men will come. When they do, we need to hold the line long enough for them to realize they've made a mistake. Tommy grinned, cracking his knuckles. Let's make sure they regret ever stepping foot on this land. Maggie nodded, her voice calm but firm. Whatever happens, we've got your back. Clara stepped forward, her frail hands gripping Jack's arm. We've built this farm through sweat and tears. We've survived storms, droughts, and heartache. We'll survive this too. Jack looked at the faces around him, loyal friends and family who had come together in the face of danger. He felt a swell of pride and responsibility. We will, he said, his voice steady, because this is our home. That night, the farm fell into an uneasy silence. Jack stood watch on the porch, Alpha at his side, the stars shining brightly above. His mind replayed every detail of the plan, every possible scenario. He knew the fight would be brutal, but he also knew they were ready. As the hours passed, the distant hum of engines reached his ears. He straightened, his hand resting on his rifle. Alpha let out a low growl, his sharp eyes fixed on the horizon. They're here, Jack muttered, his voice steady but tense. He turned and called out to the house. Everyone, get ready. Inside, Clara and the others sprang into action, taking their positions as the roar of the trucks grew louder. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant headlights cutting through the dark. The battle for the Bell family farm had begun, and he was ready to fight for everything they had built. Let's show them what we're made of. Alpha, Jack said softly. The dog barked once in agreement, and then the first shot rang out. The early morning light painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the tension building at the Bell family farm. After the long night of preparing defenses and fending off the first probing attacks from Elias Cole's outlaws, Jack Bell knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning inside the farmhouse. Clara Bell stood at the kitchen counter, rolling out dough for biscuits as if it were any other day. Despite her frail frame, there was a strength in her hands, a determination that came from decades of running the farm through hardships. But today, her focus wasn't on the dough. It was on the men and women who had gathered in her home, ready to fight for the farm. Jack leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed as he watched his grandmother. "You don't have to do all this, Grandma." Clara glanced up, her eyes sharp but kind. "I might not be able to fight like you, but I can make sure everyone's fed. You can't win a battle on an empty stomach." Jack smiled faintly. "You're tougher than all of us combined." In the barn, Jack met with the small group of neighbors who had answered his call for help. Tommy Bishop, the burly mechanic, was tinkering with an old tractor, retrofitting it with a makeshift plow blade that could double as a barricade. Maggie Wright, the no-nonsense veterinarian, was organizing medical supplies in the corner, her sharp eyes taking stock of every detail. "Got any more surprises for us, Jack?" Tommy asked, wiping grease from his hands. Jack nodded, holding up a blueprint of the farm. "We're turning this place into a trap for anyone foolish enough to step foot on it. Maggie, I'll need you to set up a triage station in the barn. Tommy, I need that tractor ready to roll, reinforced and armed if possible." Tommy grinned. "You got it, boss." As they worked, the sound of a truck engine drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Davis's rusted pickup rolled into the driveway, and two deputies stepped out, carrying a crate of supplies. "Figured you might need these," Davis said, nodding at Jack. "It's not official, but Reedridge isn't going to stand by and watch good folks like you get pushed around." Jack opened the crate to find ammunition, radios, and a few heavy-duty flashlights. "This is more than I expected," he said. "Thank you." Davis tipped his hat. "You just make sure Elias gets what's coming to him." The day was spent turning the farm into a fortress. Jack and Tommy reinforced the fences with barbed wire and added steel plates to the barn doors. Maggie set up a fully equipped first aid station, complete with stretchers and saline IVs. Sheriff Davis's deputies patrolled the perimeter, keeping an eye out for any signs of movement. Sarah, a local rancher who had grown up alongside Jack, arrived in the late afternoon with a trailer full of hay bales. "Thought these might come in handy," she said, unloading the bales. "They'll make good cover if the shooting starts." "Thanks, Sarah," Jack said, shaking her hand. "Glad you're here." Sarah smirked. "Someone's gotta keep you out of trouble." As the sun set, the group gathered in the barn for a final briefing. Jack stood in front of the blueprint, his voice steady and commanding. "Elias won't wait long. He'll come back, and when he does, he'll bring everything he's got. Our job is to make sure he regrets it." He pointed to key areas on the map. "The main attack will come from the south. That's the easiest access point, so we've reinforced it heavily. Sarah and Maggie, you'll cover the barn. Tommy, you're on the tractor. Use it to block any vehicles that get through." Davis nodded. "My deputies and I will hold the perimeter. We'll buy you as much time as we can." Jack's gaze swept the room, meeting each person's eyes. This isn't just about the farm. It's about sending a message to Elias. To anyone who thinks they can push us around, we don't back down. Not here. Not ever. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Clara, who had joined them with a tray of biscuits, spoke up. "This farm has seen storms, droughts, and hard times. We've survived them all, and we'll survive this, too." Jack smiled at his grandmother, her words strengthening his resolve. "We will." That night, Jack sat on the porch, his rifle resting across his lap. Alpha and Bravo patrolled the yard, their keen senses on high alert. The farm was quiet, but Jack's instincts told him it wouldn't stay that way for long. Inside, Clara sat by the window, knitting calmly as if nothing was amiss. Maggie was in the barn, checking her supplies one last time, while Tommy tinkered with his tractor. Sheriff Davis and his deputies sat in their truck. Scanning the dark horizon, Jack took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "They'll come soon," he muttered. Alpha let out a low growl, his ears twitching. Jack followed the dog's gaze, his sharp eyes catching the faint glint of headlights in the distance. "They're here," he said, his voice steady. He turned toward the house, raising his voice just enough to carry. "Everyone, get ready." The hum of engines grew louder, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack took his position at the front gate, Alpha at his side for Jack and his neighbors. This wasn't just a fight for a farm. It was a fight for their town, their way of life, and their future. And they were ready. The rumble of engines echoed across the night as 3 trucks rolled into the dirt road leading to the Bell family farm. Their headlights cut through the darkness, casting long shadows over the fields. Jack Bell stood at the reinforced gate, his rifle steady in his hands, Alpha growling softly at his side. The tension in the air was thick, and the faint hum of the motion sensors told Jack his preparations were working inside the farmhouse. Clara sat near the radio, listening for updates. In the barn, Maggie double-checked her medical supplies while Tommy gripped the wheel of the fortified tractor, its makeshift plow blade gleaming in the dim light. "They're here," Jack said over the comms, his voice calm but firm. "Positions." The trucks came to a stop just short of the gate. Outlaws spilled out, armed with rifles and crowbars, their laughter carrying in the cool night air. At the front of the group stood Elias Cole, his cowboy hat tilted low and a smug grin on his face. "Jack Bell," Elias called, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I told you we'd be back. How about you save us all some trouble and open the gate?" Jack didn't move. "Turn around, Elias. This is your last warning." Elias chuckled, gesturing to his men. "Boys, I think he needs a little convincing." 2 outlaws approached the gate, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. The first man reached for the lock, but as soon as his hand touched it, a deafening alarm rang out, triggered by Jack's tripwire system. The men jumped back in surprise, their rifles raised, but the damage was done. The farm's defenders were now fully aware of their position. Jack fired the first shot, the sharp crack of his rifle breaking the stillness. The bullet hit the gate post just inches from the outlaw's hand, sending him scrambling for cover. "That's the only warning you'll get," Jack said coldly. Elias scowled, motioning for his men to spread out. "Take the place. Burn it to the ground if you have to." The attack began in earnest. Outlaws fanned out, firing sporadically at the house and barn. The sound of gunfire echoed through the fields, but Jack's defenses held. Floodlights flickered on, bathing the property in harsh light and disorienting the attackers. Several men tripped over hidden tripwires, triggering noisemakers and spike traps that sent them scrambling from her vantage point near the barn. Sarah fired her rifle, her shots clean and precise. 1 outlaw dropped, then another, as she provided cover for Maggie and Tommy. "You're not getting past us," Sarah muttered. Reloading, Tommy roared to life in the fortified tractor, the engine growling as he drove it toward the attackers near the southern fence. The makeshift plow blades smashed through their cover, scattering them like leaves. "Come on, boys," Tommy shouted. "You picked the wrong farm." Elias's men regrouped near the trucks, trying to find a way through the chaos. "Stay together," Elias barked, his frustration mounting. "It's just a farm, for crying out loud." Inside the farmhouse, Clara watched the battle unfold from a window, her hand gripping the radio. "Jack, they're moving toward the eastern fence," she warned. "Copy that," Jack replied, shifting his position. He fired another shot, taking down an outlaw who had strayed too close to the gate. Alpha darted ahead, taking down another attacker with surgical precision near the barn. Maggie worked quickly to treat Sarah, who had taken a grazing shot to her shoulder. "You're lucky it didn't hit anything vital," Maggie said, her voice calm but firm. Sarah winced but nodded. "I can still shoot?" Maggie smirked. "Good. We're going to need you." The tide of the battle began to shift. Jack's traps continued to slow the attackers, and the defenders' coordinated efforts kept the outlaws from gaining any ground. Sheriff Davis and his deputies arrive late in the fight, their rifles adding firepower to the fray. Elias, now cornered near one of the trucks, glared at the chaos around him. "Pull back," he shouted to his men. "Regroup at the camp." The outlaws retreated, their trucks kicking up dust as they sped away. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the farm eerily quiet once more as the defenders regrouped. Jack stood at the gate, his rifle still in hand. Alpha trotted up to him, his tail wagging slightly despite the tension. Jack knelt down, scratching the dog's ears. "Good work, boy." Clara appeared on the porch, her face pale but determined. "They'll be back, won't they?" Jack nodded. "They will, but next time, they'll think twice." Tommy walked up, his face streaked with dirt but his grin unshaken. "You sure know how to throw a party, Belle." Jack smirked. "We're just getting started." Inside the farmhouse, Maggie patched up the wounded while Jack and the others reviewed the night's events. "They'll regroup," Jack said, his voice serious. "We hit them hard, but Elias won't stop until we force him to." Davis leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've got the town's support, Jack. Whatever you need, we'll back you." Jack looked at the map spread out on the table, his mind already working through the next steps. "We're not just defending the farm anymore. It's time to take the fight to them." Clara placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." Jack looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of his friends and neighbors. They had fought together and won the first round. Now, they were ready to finish the fight. "Let's end this," he said, and with that, the battle for the Bell family farm entered its next phase. The morning after the battle dawned clear and quiet. But the scars of the previous night's attack were evident. Broken boards, spent shells, and trampled earth told the story of the outlaws' failed assault. Despite the victory, Jack Bell knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Elias Cole and his men would regroup, and next time, they wouldn't hold back. Jack stood at the kitchen table, his sharp eyes scanning the map of the region spread out before him. Sheriff Davis, Tommy, Sarah, Maggie, and Clara gathered around, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. "They'll come back," Jack said, his voice steady. "But if we can figure out where they're regrouping, we can hit them first." Davis nodded, leaning on the back of a chair. "We saw them heading west. There's not much out that way except the old quarry." "That makes sense," Tommy said, crossing his arms. "Plenty of cover, and it's close enough for them to launch another attack." Jack traced his finger over the map, his mind racing. The quarry could be more than a hideout. If Elias is using it as a base of operations, it might explain how he's funding this. Clara frowned. "Funding? What do you mean?" Jack looked at her, his expression grim. "These men aren't just bullies, Grandma. They're organized. They've got weapons, vehicles, and supplies. That takes money." By mid-morning, the team had devised a plan. Jack, Sarah, and Alpha would scout the quarry to confirm whether it was the outlaws' base. Sheriff Davis and his deputies would patrol the farm's perimeter in case Elias attempted another attack. Tommy and Maggie would stay behind to repair the farm's defenses and assist Clara with preparations before leaving. Jack pulled Clara aside. "Are you sure you're okay staying here?" Clara placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady. "This is my home, Jack. I've faced worse than this, and I'm not going anywhere." Jack smiled faintly, her resilience strengthening his own resolve. "We'll be back soon." Jack, Sarah, and Alpha drove out toward the quarry, the truck kicking up clouds of dust as they traveled the rugged road. The landscape grew harsher the closer they got, with jagged rocks and dry brush dominating the scenery. Jack parked the truck a mile from the quarry, the trio proceeding on foot to avoid detection. The quarry came into view as they crested a hill. From their vantage point, they could see the sprawling operation below. Trucks were parked in neat rows, with armed men patrolling the perimeter. Large tarps covered stacks of crates, and a makeshift command tent stood near the center of the camp. "Looks like we found their nest," Sarah whispered, peering through the scope of her rifle. "What are they guarding under those tarps?" Jack pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the scene. "Supplies, maybe weapons. Whatever it is, it's important to them." Alpha crouched beside Jack, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. Jack scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good boy. Stay sharp." The team spent hours observing the camp, documenting the Outlaws' movements and defenses. Jack noted the positions of the guards, the location of their vehicles, and the layout of the camp. But it wasn't until a black SUV arrived that things took a darker turn. The vehicle rolled to a stop near the command tent, and a man stepped out, tall, sharply dressed, and radiating authority. He exchanged a few words with Elias, who seemed almost deferential in his presence. "Who's that?" Sarah asked. Her voice low. Jack's expression darkened. "That's not just another thug. He's the one pulling the strings." They watched as the man opened the back of the SUV, revealing a briefcase. Elias inspected the contents before nodding and shaking the man's hand. "Money?" Jack said. "Elias isn't just running a gang. He's part of something bigger." As the sun began to set, Jack and Sarah retreated from their position, careful not to leave any trace of their presence. Back at the truck, Jack spread out a notepad, jotting down everything they had observed. "This isn't just about the farm," he said. "The quarry is their supply hub. If we take it out, we cripple them." Sarah nodded. "And if we get that briefcase, we might find out who's backing Elias." Jack loaded Alpha into the truck and started the engine. "We need to move fast. They're planning something big, and we have to stop them before it reaches the farm." Back at the farm, Jack gathered the team in the barn, outlining the situation. Elias is working for someone else, a bigger player who's funding this whole operation. The quarry is their base. If we hit it, we can cut off their resources and force Elias to come to us. Sheriff Davis frowned. "It's a risky move. They've got the numbers, and they know the terrain. That's why we use surprise." Jack said, "We hit them fast and hard, disable their vehicles, destroy their supplies, and take whatever intel we can find." Tommy grinned, his excitement barely contained. "Finally, we get to take the fight to them." Maggie was more reserved. "If we're doing this, we need to be ready for casualties. They won't go down without a fight." Jack looked at each member of the team, his expression resolute. "This isn't just about the farm anymore. If we don't stop them here, they'll keep spreading their violence to the rest of the town. We have a chance to end this now, for good." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady despite her age. "You've got my blessing, Jack. Do what you have to do." The team spent the night preparing for the mission. Tommy worked on the vehicles, adding reinforcements and repairing damaged parts. Sarah fine-tuned her rifle, while Maggie packed medical supplies and Sheriff Davis gathered extra ammunition as the moon rose high above the farm. Jack stood on the porch, gazing out at the dark horizon. Alpha sat beside him, his ears perked. "We're almost there, boy," Jack said softly. "One more push." The dog let out a quiet bark, as if to say he was ready. Jack's jaw tightened. The next battle wouldn't just be for the farm. It would be for everything they had fought to protect. And he was determined to win. The sun rose slowly over San Cielo Farm, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside the farmhouse, the team gathered for breakfast, the quiet before the storm weighing heavily on everyone. Jack Bell stood by the window, his coffee untouched, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The information they had gathered from the quarry had painted a clear picture. Elias Cole wasn't just a local thug. He was a puppet in a larger scheme. And the fight to protect the farm had become a fight to save the town. Clara Bell moved quietly through the kitchen, serving up plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. Despite the tension, she carried herself with the same calm determination that had defined her for nearly a century. "You need to eat, Jack," Clara said, setting a plate in front of him. "Can't go into battle on an empty stomach." Jack turned from the window, his expression softening as he looked at her. "Thanks, Grandma. You're keeping us all going." Clara smiled faintly but didn't sit. She had been watching Jack carefully over the past few days, seeing the weight of his responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for the farm. He was carrying the legacy of their family, the sacrifices made by generations before him. After breakfast, Clara pulled Jack aside, leading him to the porch where they could talk privately. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the nearby fields. Jack, Clara began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I want you to know how proud I am of you. Jack looked at her, surprised by the sudden sentiment. Grandma, you don't have to. Let me finish. Clara interrupted gently. Your grandfather built this farm with his bare hands. He poured his heart and soul into this land, not just for us, but for the future. And now, you're doing the same. Jack's gaze drifted to the fields, the memories of his childhood flooding back. He could see his grandfather, Henry Bell, working tirelessly under the hot sun, always with a smile and a story to tell. The farm had been more than a livelihood. It had been a symbol of hope, resilience, and family. I just wish Grandpa could see all this, Jack said quietly. See what we're fighting for. Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. He'd be proud of you, Jack, just like I am. But this fight, it's not just about the farm anymore, is it? Jack hesitated, then shook his head. No, Elias and his backers, they're not just trying to take the farm. They're trying to take everything. The town, the people, the future. If we don't stop them, no one will. Clara's grip tightened. Then you fight, Jack. Fight like your grandfather did. Fight for this land, this family, and this community. Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. I will. The team spent the rest of the day preparing for the mission to the quarry. Jack worked tirelessly alongside Tommy to reinforce their vehicles and weapons. Sarah fine-tuned her sniper rifle, while Maggie organized the medical supplies, ensuring they were ready for anything as the sun began to set. The group gathered in the barn for a final briefing. Jack stood at the center, the map of the quarry spread out on a table. He pointed to the marked locations of the supply tents, vehicles, and command center. We hit them hard and fast, Jack said. Our goal is to destroy their supplies, disable their vehicles, and gather intel on whoever's backing Elias. This isn't just a raid, it's a message. Tommy grinned, his excitement barely contained. They'll think twice before messing with Ridge after this. Sheriff Davis, ever the voice of caution, added, let's make sure we all come back in one piece. Jack looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each of them. This isn't just about us. It's about protecting everyone who depends on this town. We're not just defending a farm, we're defending our way of life. That evening, Jack found himself sitting with Clara on the porch. The stars above were brilliant, untainted by the lights of the town. Alpha and Bravo lay at their feet, their steady breathing a soothing rhythm. Jack? Clara said softly, breaking the silence. You don't have to do this alone. Jack glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I'm not alone. Grandma, I've got all of you. Clara shook her head. I mean the burden you're carrying. You've always tried to protect everyone, even when you were a boy. But sometimes, it's okay to lean on others. Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling over him. He had always been the one to shoulder the responsibility, the one who stepped in when things got tough. But she was right. This fight wasn't just his. I'll try, he said quietly. Clara smiled. That's all I ask. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the team prepared to leave for the quarry. The vehicles were loaded, the weapons checked and rechecked. Jack gave Clara a final hug before climbing into the truck. You stay safe, Jack, Clara said, her voice firm. We need you to come back. Jack nodded. I will. As the convoy of vehicles rolled out of the farm, Clara stood on the porch, watching until they disappeared into the distance. She whispered a quiet prayer, her hands clasped tightly. Come back to us, she murmured in the truck. Jack stared straight ahead, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. The fight ahead would be dangerous, but it was necessary. As he glanced at Alpha, who sat alertly in the passenger seat, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about family, legacy, and the future of everyone in Ridge. And Jack was ready to do whatever it took to protect it. The road stretched out before them, the quarry looming on the horizon. The battle was coming, and Jack Bell was ready. The convoy rolled into Ridge just as the sun crested the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. The small town, usually quiet and unassuming, had been transformed by Elias Cole's reign of intimidation. Shutters were drawn tight. Businesses were closed. And the once bustling Main Street was eerily silent. Jack Bell had seen this kind of fear before, in war zones where civilians lived under constant threat. But this was different. This was home. Jack parked the truck near the town square, stepping out with Alpha at his side. Sarah, Tommy, and Sheriff Davis followed, their faces set with determination. The group moved toward the sheriff's office, where a handful of deputies were waiting, their nerves evident despite their training. Inside, Davis addressed the group, his voice steady despite the tension. Elias has everyone scared stiff. He's been targeting anyone who stands up to him. Farmers, shopkeepers, even the preacher. People are too afraid to fight back. That's exactly what he wants, Jack said, leaning against the wall. Fear is his weapon. If we let him keep using it, he wins. Sarah nodded, her voice sharp. Then we take it away from him. But how? Most of the town's too scared to even talk about Elias, let alone stand up to him. Jack glanced out the window, his sharp eyes scanning the street. We show them it's possible. We give them a reason to believe they can fight back. Jack's first stop was the hardware store, where he found Mr. Walters, the elderly owner, sweeping the floor behind the counter. Walters looked up as Jack entered, his expression wary. Jack Bell? Walters said, setting the broom aside. Didn't expect to see you back in town. Jack offered a faint smile. Didn't expect to come back, but here I am. Walters's gaze flicked toward Alpha, then back to Jack. Word's been going around about what you've been doing at the farm, standing up to Elias. That's the plan, Jack said simply. But we need more than just my team. We need the town to stand with us. Walters frowned, his expression clouded with doubt. Elias has too many men, too many guns. People are scared. Jack, you can't blame them for that. I don't blame them, Jack said, his voice steady. But if we let Elias keep pushing us around, where does it end? He won't stop until he owns everything. The farm, the town, the whole valley. Walters hesitated, then nodded slowly. You're right. I'll do what I can to help. Jack and Sarah spent the rest of the morning visiting the townspeople, knocking on doors and speaking to anyone who would listen. Some were hesitant, their fear palpable, but others, like Walters, began to see the possibility of resistance at the church. They met Father Miguel, who had been quietly organizing food and supplies for families targeted by Elias. The priest listened as Jack outlined the plan to hit the quarry, his expression grave but resolute. I'll rally those who are willing, Father Miguel said. Elias has taken too much from this town already. It's time to take it back. By afternoon, word had spread through Ridge. Small groups of townspeople gathered in the square, whispering about Jack's return and the stand he was preparing to take. Sheriff Davis and his deputies patrolled the area, their presence a quiet reassurance. Jack stood at the center of the square, addressing the growing crowd. His voice carried over the murmurs, calm but commanding. I know what you're feeling. I felt it too. Fear can paralyze you, make you believe there's no way out. But fear is just a weapon, and like any weapon, it can be broken. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. Elias wants you to think you're powerless, but together, we're stronger than he could ever be. This is our town, our homes, our lives, and we're not giving them up without a fight. The crowd grew quiet. Then a voice called out from the back. What do you need from us? Jack smiled faintly. Your courage, your willingness to stand together. And if you've got tools, supplies, or skills that can help, bring them to the farm. We're going to make sure Elias knows he picked the wrong town to mess with. By evening, trucks and cars began arriving at the Bell farm, loaded with everything from lumber and nails to old hunting rifles. The townspeople worked alongside Jack's team, repairing fences, building fortifications, and setting traps in the barn. Maggie oversaw the medical preparations, training volunteers in basic first aid. Sarah worked with the men and women who brought firearms, teaching them how to handle and maintain their weapons. Tommy and his crew reinforced the vehicles, turning them into makeshift tanks. Clara moved through the crowd with quiet authority, offering food, water, and words of encouragement. Despite her age, she was a beacon of strength. her presence inspiring those around her as the sun set over the farm. The mood shifted. What had started as fear and doubt was transforming into hope and determination. Jack stood on the porch, watching as the townspeople worked together. Their unity a powerful force. Sheriff Davis approached, his hat in hand. "You've done something I didn't think was possible, Jack. You've given them a reason to fight." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "We're not just fighting for the farm anymore. We're fighting for the future, and we're not going to lose." That night, the farm fell quiet as the defenders rested in preparation for the battle ahead. Jack sat on the porch with Alpha at his feet, the dog steady breathing a comforting presence. Clara joined him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "You've given them hope, Jack. That's more than most men could do." Jack looked at her, his expression softening. "I just gave them a reason to remember who they are. This town's been through hard times before. It'll get through this too." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Thanks to you." Jack's gaze shifted to the horizon, where the faint outline of the quarry loomed in the distance. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt the odds tipping in their favor. "We're ready," he said quietly, and with that, he prepared for the final push to take back everything Elias Cole had stolen. The night air was cool as Jack Bell and Sarah crouched behind a rocky outcropping overlooking the quarry. The faint hum of machinery and muffled voices drifted up from the outlaw camp below. Through his binoculars, Jack scanned the scene, his sharp eyes taking in every detail: the layout of the tents, the positions of the guards, and the glow of the command tent at the center. "This is definitely their base of operations," Sarah whispered, her rifle resting on a nearby rock. "They've got everything down there: vehicles, weapons, supplies. It's a gold mine." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "And if we take it out, Elias loses his grip on Ridge." The pair had spent hours observing the camp, carefully documenting the movements of the guards and the structure of the operation. Jack's SEAL training came alive in moments like this, his mind piecing together a plan with precision. Sarah, a skilled marksman in her own right, worked seamlessly beside him, her quiet competence a steadying force. "See that truck near the fuel depot?" Sarah said, gesturing toward a cluster of vehicles. "If we can take it out, the whole depot goes with it." Jack followed her line of sight, nodding in agreement. "Good eye. That'll take out most of their supplies in one shot." "But what about the command tent?" Sarah asked. "That's where Elias will be, if he's here." "He'll be here," Jack said, his voice low but certain. "He's not just running this camp. He's getting orders from someone else. That's where we'll find the proof." As the hours passed, Jack and Sarah gathered enough intel to finalize their plan. They retreated from the outcropping under the cover of darkness, moving silently back to the truck where Alpha waited patiently. The dog's ears perked as they approached, his tail wagging slightly. Jack knelt down, scratching behind Alpha's ears. "Good boy. Let's head back." The drive to the farm was quiet, the weight of what lay ahead settling over them. Jack's mind raced with strategies, contingencies, and risks. He knew the next move would be critical, not just for the farm, but for the town. Back at San Cielo, the team gathered in the barn, the tension palpable as Jack laid out the details of the plan. A map of the quarry was spread across the table, marked with notes and symbols from Jack and Sarah's reconnaissance. "Our objective is twofold," Jack began. "First, we hit their supplies, fuel, weapons, vehicles. Without those, they can't launch another attack. Second, we secure whatever intel we can find in the command tent. If we can prove who's backing Elias, we can shut this whole operation down." Tommy leaned over the map, his excitement barely contained. "Sounds like a smash and grab. Right up my alley." Sheriff Davis, ever the realist, frowned. "And what about their numbers? They've got more men than we do, and they know the terrain. That's why we rely on speed and surprise." Jack replied, "We move in fast, hit them hard, and get out before they can regroup." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "I'll cover from the ridge. If they try to flank us, I'll take them out." Maggie spoke up, her tone calm but firm. "And if anyone gets hurt, I'll be ready. Just make sure you get them back to me." Jack looked around the room, his gaze meeting each person's. This is our chance to end it. Elias has been pushing us around for too long. But tonight, we push back. Clara, who had been quietly listening from the corner, stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone with pride. You've already done so much, Jack. No matter what happens, I know your grandfather would be proud. Jack nodded, her words strengthening his resolve. Let's finish this. The convoy set out just before midnight, the vehicles moving quietly along the back roads toward the quarry. Jack and Sarah led the way in the first truck, with Alpha sitting alertly in the back. The moonlight cast long shadows over the desert, the faint glow of the quarry growing brighter as they approached. The team parked their vehicles a mile from the site, continuing on foot to maintain the element of surprise. Each member carried their gear with practiced ease, their footsteps silent on the rocky ground when they reached the ridge overlooking the quarry. Jack gave the signal for everyone to take their positions. Sarah set up her sniper rifle, scanning the camp for targets. Tommy and two deputies crept toward the fuel depot, their bags of explosives slung over their shoulders. Sheriff Davis and another deputy covered the eastern approach. Keeping watch for reinforcements, Jack and Alpha moved toward the command tent, their steps deliberate and silent. As they approached, they could hear muffled voices inside, Elias's distinct drawl among them. You think this town can hold out much longer? Elias was saying. They're cracking. It's just a matter of time. Another voice responded, this one colder and more calculated. Time is money. Elias, the more you delay, the more expensive this gets. Deliver results, or we'll find someone who can. Jack's eyes narrowed. He recognized the tone, corporate, detached, and ruthless. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just backing Elias. He was running the show. Jack signaled to Alpha, who darted forward and slipped under the edge of the tent. Moments later, the dog let out a low growl, drawing the attention of the men inside. The distraction gave Jack the opening he needed. He moved swiftly, stepping into the tent with his rifle raised. Don't move, Jack said, his voice cold and commanding. Elias froze, his eyes wide with shock. The man in the suit, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. Well, the man said, adjusting his tie. This is unexpected. Jack ignored him, his focus on Elias. It's over. Call off your men. Elias sneered. You think you've won? This is bigger than you. Bell, you can't stop it. Watch me, Jack said before Elias could respond. A distant explosion rocked the camp. Tommy's charges had detonated, lighting up the night as the fuel depot went up in flames. Chaos erupted as outlaws scrambled to respond, their shouts echoing through the quarry. Jack smirked. Looks like your operation's running on empty. With the camp in chaos, Jack secured the briefcase the suited man had brought, then signaled for the team to retreat. Alpha stayed close as they moved through the shadows. Regrouping with Sarah and the others near the ridge, the mission was a success. The outlaws' supplies were destroyed, and the briefcase held the evidence they needed to expose the operation. But Jack knew the fight wasn't over as the team made their way back to the farm. The faint glow of the burning quarry lit up the horizon. Elias and his men had been dealt a heavy blow, but Jack was certain of one thing. The final battle was still to come. The convoy of trucks rolled into the Bell family farm just before dawn, the horizon tinged with the faint glow of a new day. The team was exhausted but triumphant. The mission at the quarry had been a success. Elias's operation was in shambles, his supplies destroyed, and the evidence they'd recovered promised to unravel the shadowy network. Behind him, Jack Bell stepped out of the lead truck, the briefcase tucked under his arm. Alpha hopped down beside him, his tail wagging slightly despite the tension that still hung in the air. Clara Bell stood on the porch, her face a mixture of relief and pride. You did it, she said as Jack approached. Jack nodded, his voice steady. We hurt them, Grandma, but this isn't over. Inside the farmhouse, the team gathered around the kitchen table. The briefcase Jack had taken from the quarry sat open, its contents spread out before them. Documents, maps, and financial records painted a clear picture of Elias's operation and the powerful forces funding it. This is bigger than we thought, Sheriff Davis said, leaning over the table. It's not just Elias. He's working for a corporation, Frontier Consolidated. They've been using him to intimidate landowners and secure properties in the valley. Jack tapped a map marked with red circles. They're after mineral rights. This isn't just about the farm. It's about the entire region. If we don't stop them here, they'll take everything. Sarah frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the documents. We've got the proof now. Can't we take this to the authorities? Davis shook his head. It's not that simple. Frontier Consolidated has money, lawyers, and influence. If we don't hit them hard enough to break their operation, they'll just bury us in red tape. Jack's jaw tightened. Then we finish this. Word of the mission's success spread quickly through Reed Ridge. By mid-morning, trucks and cars began arriving at the farm, carrying townspeople eager to help. Men and women brought tools, supplies, and weapons, their faces set with determination. For the first time in months, there was hope and a shared purpose. Father Miguel arrived with a group of volunteers, his calm presence a steadying force. You've given the town something to believe in, Jack, he said. We're ready to stand with you. Jack shook his hand firmly. We'll need everyone we can get. Elias won't back down, and neither will his bosses. The farm became a hive of activity as the townspeople worked alongside Jack's team. The barn was transformed into a supply depot, with crates of ammunition and first aid supplies stacked neatly against the walls. Tommy led a crew of mechanics, reinforcing vehicles and building barricades from scrap metal. Sarah took charge of training the volunteers, teaching them basic firearm safety and defensive tactics. Despite their inexperience, the townspeople were eager to learn, their fear replaced by a determination to protect their home. Even Clara found a way to contribute, organizing meals and supplies for the growing army of defenders. Her quiet strength inspired those around her, a reminder of the resilience that had defined the Bell family for generations. As night fell, Jack stood on the porch, watching the activity below. The farm was no longer just a home. It was a stronghold, a symbol of resistance. Alpha sat at his feet, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Clara joined him, her expression thoughtful. It's amazing what people can do when they come together, she said softly. Jack nodded. It's more than I expected, but it's what we needed. They believe in you, Jack, Clara said, placing a hand on his arm. You've given them a reason to fight. Jack looked out at the farm, his gaze steady. This isn't just my fight, Grandma. It's all of ours. The next morning, the townspeople gathered in the barn for a final briefing. Jack stood at the center, his calm authority commanding attention. A large map of the region was pinned to the wall, marked with key points from the intel they'd recovered. Elias and his men will come, Jack began. We hit them hard at the quarry, and they'll be desperate to retaliate. But we've got the advantage. We know the terrain, and we've got something they don't, unity. He pointed to the map. They'll come from the west, using the main road to bring in vehicles and reinforcements. Sheriff Davis and his deputies will hold the bottleneck near the ridge. Tommy and the mechanics will man the barricades, while Sarah and her team provide sniper support from the eastern ridge. Jack's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of each person. This isn't just about stopping Elias. It's about sending a message to him, to Frontier Consolidated, and to anyone who thinks they can take what's ours. This is our land, our home, and we're not giving it up. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing into a chorus of determination as the defenders returned to their positions. Clara pulled Jack aside. You've done more than I ever could have hoped, Jack, she said, her voice filled with emotion. No matter what happens, I want you to know how proud I am of you. Jack wrapped her in a gentle hug. I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma. Clara smiled, her eyes shining. Then let's show them what the Bell family is made of. As the sun began to set, the farm fell into an expectant silence. The defenders took their positions, their nerves tempered by the unity they had built. Jack stood at the gate with Alpha at his side, his rifle ready in the distance. The faint hum of engines grew louder. They're coming, Sarah said over the radio. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Everyone hold your ground. This is our home. Let's make sure they never forget it. And as the headlights appeared on the horizon, The defenders braced themselves for the battle that would decide the future of Reed Ridge. The sound of engines echoed across the open plains as Elias Cole's convoy appeared on the horizon. The headlights of the trucks cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating a column of vehicles that churned up clouds of dust as they advanced toward the Bell family farm. From his position at the main gate, Jack Bell could see the outline of the attackers, dozens of men armed and ready, their confidence evident in the way they moved. "This is it," Jack said into the radio clipped to his vest. "They're coming. Everyone, hold your positions." The defenders were ready. Sarah and her team of sharpshooters were stationed on the eastern ridge, their rifles trained on the approaching convoy. Sheriff Davis and his deputies manned the barricades at the main road, their vehicles positioned to create a choke point. Tommy and the mechanics were spread across the farm, using the fortified tractors and trucks as mobile defenses. Maggie, calm and focused, was in the barn, preparing for casualties. Clara Bell stood at the farmhouse, her presence a quiet source of strength. She wasn't armed, but her resolve was as firm as any fighter's. "Jack," she said over the radio, her voice steady, "they won't get past us. Not today." As the first trucks reached the main road, Sheriff Davis raised his hand, signaling his deputies to wait. The outlaws slowed, their vehicles rumbling to a halt as they encountered the barricades. Elias stepped out of the lead truck, his expression one of smug confidence. He raised a megaphone, his voice carrying over the distance. "Jack Bell," Elias called, "we know you're in there. Let's make this simple. Give up the farm, and no one has to get hurt." Jack, watching from the gate, didn't respond. Instead, he keyed his radio. "Sarah, take out the lead vehicle's engine." A moment later, a single shot rang out, and the engine of Elias's truck sputtered and died. Smoke billowed from the hood, throwing the convoy into chaos. Elias stumbled back, his face twisting in fury. "So that's how it's gonna be," he snarled. "Fine, take it down." The outlaws opened fire, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the air. Sheriff Davis and his deputies returned fire, their position behind the barricades providing excellent cover. The narrow road became a bottleneck, forcing Elias's men to advance on foot. "Tommy," Jack said over the radio, "engage." From behind the barn, Tommy roared into action, his fortified tractor, fitted with a plow blade reinforced with steel, barreled into the fray. The massive vehicle smashed through the side of one of the trucks, sending outlaws scrambling for cover. "That's for messing with Reed Ridge," Tommy shouted, grinning as he swung the tractor around for another pass. Meanwhile, Sarah and her sharpshooters worked with deadly precision, picking off targets from the ridge. Every time an outlaw tried to flank the defenders, a well-placed shot sent them reeling back. The attackers' confidence began to falter, replaced by frustration and fear. "Jack?" Sarah said over the radio. "They're spreading out, trying to flank from the north." "Hold them off," Jack replied. "I'll handle the gate." At the main gate, the outlaws launched their first direct assault. They rushed forward, weapons blazing, only to encounter Jack's meticulously planned defenses. The motion sensors activated floodlights, bathing the area in blinding light and throwing the attackers into disarray. Hidden spike strips punctured tires, while tripwires triggered loud, disorienting alarms. Jack and Alpha moved like shadows through the chaos. Jack's rifle barked as he took down one attacker after another, while Alpha darted forward, taking out those who got too close. The dog's speed and precision were unmatched, leaving the outlaws scrambling. "Keep pushing," Elias shouted from the rear, his voice rising in desperation. "They can't hold forever." But Elias was wrong. The defenders were not just holding, they were winning inside the farmhouse. Clara moved calmly between the windows, keeping watch. She wasn't armed, but her radio was clipped to her apron, and her voice carried steady updates to the defenders. "Two more moving toward the barn," she reported. "Maggie, they're heading your way." "I see them," Maggie replied. Moments later, the sound of a shotgun echoed from the barn, and the threat was neutralized as the battle raged on. Jack's radio crackled to life. "Jack," Sheriff Davis said, his tone urgent. "They've got reinforcements coming from the west. Another convoy." Jack's jaw tightened. How far out? 10 minutes. Maybe less. Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing. We can't let them surround us. Sarah, shift your team to cover the west. On it. Sarah replied. The Outlaws made one final push toward the farmhouse. But Jack was ready. As they charged the gate, he activated the last line of defenses, a series of explosives buried near the entrance. The ground shook as the charges detonated, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. The attackers were thrown back, their ranks shattered. Elias, watching from a safe distance, realized his forces were crumbling. He climbed into one of the remaining trucks, shouting orders to retreat. Fall back, he yelled. Regroup at the secondary site. The surviving Outlaws scrambled to obey, retreating under a hail of gunfire from the defenders. Within minutes, the convoy disappeared into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of their failed assault. The farm fell silent, the only sound the distant hum of the retreating vehicles. Jack lowered his rifle, his chest heaving as he surveyed the battlefield. The barricades were scorched, the ground littered with debris, but the farm still stood. We did it, Sarah said over the radio, her voice weary but triumphant. Jack nodded, his hand resting on Alpha's head. We held. Inside the farmhouse, Clara embraced Jack tightly, her relief palpable. You saved us, she whispered. Jack shook his head. We saved us. Everyone played their part. Tommy staggered in, covered in dirt but grinning ear to ear. That was one hell of a fight. Belle. Maggie joined them, her expression serious. We've got some injuries, but nothing we can't handle. Sheriff Davis entered last, his hat in hand. You pulled it off, Jack. You held the line. Jack looked around at the faces of his friends and neighbors, their unity stronger than ever. This isn't over, he said. Elias will regroup, and when he does, we'll be ready. But for now, they had won the battle, and for the first time in months, the people of Ridge dared to hope that they could win the war. The Bell family farm stood in the quiet aftermath of the battle. The once pristine fields were littered with debris, the scars of the night's fight visible in the churned-up earth and shattered fences. Yet, despite the damage, the defenders stood tall. They had not only survived but sent a powerful message to Elias Cole and his men. Ridge would not fall without a fight. Jack Bell sat on the porch steps, his rifle leaning against the railing. Alpha lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, ears twitching at every distant sound. Jack's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, ever vigilant, even as the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky behind him. The farmhouse buzzed with quiet activity. Maggie worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, her makeshift medical station in the barn a hub of care. Sheriff Davis and his deputies patrolled the perimeter, ensuring the remaining defenses were secure. Clara moved between groups of volunteers, offering food and calm encouragement. Her steady presence was like a balm for the nerves of the tired townspeople. You should rest, Clara said softly, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. Jack shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Not yet. They'll be back. By midday, the defenders gathered in the barn to regroup and assess their situation. Maps of the region were spread out on a table, marked with notes and observations from the previous night's battle. Jack stood at the center, his presence commanding but approachable. We hurt them, Jack began, his voice steady. They lost supplies, vehicles, and a lot of men. But Elias isn't the kind to back down. He'll regroup, and when he does, he'll come at us with everything he has. Tommy leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Then we take the fight to him, hit his base before he can hit us again. Sheriff Davis nodded in agreement. I've got men ready. Just give the word. Jack hesitated, his mind racing with strategies. We can't rush this. If we go in blind, we're no better than they are. We need to be smart, precise. One wrong move, and we lose everything. As the group deliberated, a young boy from the town, no more than 12, ran into the barn, his face flushed with excitement. Mr. Bell, he exclaimed, they're talking about you in town. People are saying you stood up to Elias and won. The room fell silent as the boy's words sank in. Jack knelt to meet the boy's gaze. What's your name? Tommy Jr., the boy replied, His chest puffed out with pride. "My dad's been helping build barricades. He said you're like a hero." Jack smiled faintly, ruffling the boy's hair. "Your dad's the real hero. He's out there protecting all of us." The boy grinned and ran off. Leaving a ripple of renewed energy in his wake, the defenders worked tirelessly through the afternoon, repairing the damage from the previous night and strengthening their fortifications. Clara coordinated the efforts, her calm demeanor inspiring those around her. Jack oversaw the rebuilding, his keen eye catching every detail as he walked the perimeter with Sarah. She spoke up, her tone curious. "Do you ever stop to think about what you're doing here, Jack? This isn't just about the farm anymore. You've got the whole town looking to you." Jack shrugged, his gaze steady. "It's not about me. It's about all of us. This farm, this town, it's worth fighting for." Sarah smirked. "You're a good leader, Jack, whether you want to admit it or not." As the sun began to set, Clara called the group together for a meal. The defenders gathered around long wooden tables set up in the barn, the smell of Clara's cooking lifting their spirits. Laughter and conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped them just a day before. Jack stood at the head of the table, raising his glass of water. "To all of you," he said, his voice carrying over the noise, "for your courage, your strength, and your belief in this town. We're not just defending the farm, we're defending each other, and that's something worth fighting for." The group raised their glasses in unison, a cheer rising into the air as night fell. Jack and Clara sat on the porch, the farm quiet but alive with hope. Alpha lay at their feet, his steady breathing a comfort. "You've done something incredible, Jack," Clara said, her voice filled with pride. "You've shown them that standing up to bullies like Elias is possible." Jack looked out at the dark horizon, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about standing up, Grandma. It's about making sure they don't have to live in fear anymore. That's what we're fighting for." Clara nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Your grandfather would be so proud." Jack's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. "We're almost there. Just one more push." As the stars filled the sky, Jack walked the perimeter one last time. The farm was quiet, but his instincts told him the battle was far from over. Elias Cole had been dealt a heavy blow, but Jack knew the outlaw leader wouldn't stop until he was defeated for good, and Jack Bell was determined to make sure that happened. The next move was theirs, and Jack was ready to seize the advantage. The morning sun rose over the Bell family farm, casting long shadows across the fortified fields. Jack Bell stood at the main gate, Alpha at his side, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The quiet was unnerving, and he knew it was the calm before the storm. Elias Cole wouldn't stay hidden for long, not after the blow they dealt him at the quarry inside the farmhouse. The defenders gathered for a final briefing. The barn was a hive of activity as volunteers loaded supplies into vehicles, checked weapons, and prepared for the next phase of the fight. Sheriff Davis, Tommy, Sarah, Maggie, and Clara were all present, their faces a mix of determination and exhaustion. Jack stood at the center, a map of the region spread across the table. "We've got the upper hand," he began. "Elias is on the run, and his resources are stretched thin, but we can't let him regroup. We need to end this today." Sheriff Davis nodded. "We've been tracking his movements. He's holed up in an old warehouse on the edge of the valley. It's isolated, but heavily guarded." "Perfect," Jack said, his tone calm but resolute. "If he's hiding, that means he's scared, and scared men make mistakes." Sarah leaned forward, her sniper rifle slung across her back. "What's the plan?" Jack pointed to the map. "We split into two teams. Team Alpha, me, Sarah, and Tommy, will infiltrate the warehouse. We'll neutralize Elias and secure the intel he's holding. Team Bravo, Sheriff Davis, Maggie, and the deputies will cover the perimeter and cut off any escape routes." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "And what if it's a trap?" Jack met her gaze. "Then we spring it and make sure they regret setting it." By midday, the convoy was on the move. Trucks rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust as they headed toward the valley. The defenders were silent, their focus razor sharp. Each person knew the stakes. They weren't just fighting for the farm anymore. They were fighting for the future of Ridge as they approached the warehouse. Jack called for the convoy to stop. The group disembarked, moving quietly through the brush to get a closer look. The warehouse was a sprawling structure, its metal walls rusted and dented from years of neglect. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements methodical. "Looks like he's dug in," Sarah whispered, peering through her rifle scope. "Good," Jack said. "That means he's desperate." The teams moved into position. Sheriff Davis and his deputies set up roadblocks on the only access road, their rifles trained on the warehouse. Maggie established a medical station nearby, ready to treat any injuries. Meanwhile, Jack, Sarah, and Tommy crept toward the building, using the shadows for cover as they approached the main entrance. Jack gave a silent signal. Sarah took her position on a nearby ridge, her rifle trained on the guards. Tommy pulled out a set of bolt cutters, snipping through the chain-link fence with practiced ease. "Ready?" Jack asked. His voice barely audible. Tommy grinned. "Let's do this." The first guard went down silently, a single shot from Sarah's rifle dropping him before he could sound the alarm. Jack and Tommy moved swiftly, neutralizing 2 more guards with suppressed weapons. The team entered the warehouse through a side door, the interior dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and rust. Stacks of crates and barrels created a maze-like environment, and the sound of voices echoed through the cavernous space. Jack motioned for Tommy to take the left flank while he moved forward in the center of the warehouse. Elias Cole stood near a large table, surrounded by his remaining men. The outlaw leader's face was twisted with frustration, his voice rising as he barked orders. "They're closing in on us," Elias shouted. "We need to move now." One of his men hesitated. "But the intel—" "Forget the intel," Elias snapped. "If we stay here, we're dead." Jack crept closer, his rifle trained on Elias. He motioned for Sarah to cover the upper level, where 2 guards patrolled with assault rifles. Her shots were precise, the guards dropping silently to the floor. Elias turned at the sound, his eyes widening in alarm. "They're here," he shouted. "Kill them." Chaos erupted as the remaining guards opened fire. Jack and Tommy moved in tandem, using the crates for cover as they returned fire. The sound of gunfire echoed through the warehouse, the flashes illuminating the dark corners of the room. "Elias is making a run for it," Sarah called over the radio. Jack spotted the outlaw leader darting toward a side door, a briefcase clutched in his hand. "I've got him," Jack said. Breaking into a sprint, Elias burst out of the warehouse, his breath ragged as he ran toward a waiting truck. Alpha, ever vigilant, darted out of the shadows, intercepting him with a powerful leap. The dog knocked Elias to the ground, his teeth bared in a warning growl. Jack emerged moments later, his rifle trained on Elias. "It's over," he said coldly. "You've got nowhere to run." Elias glared up at him, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won? You don't know who you're dealing with. Frontier Consolidated will bury you." Jack stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "Not if we bury them first." Sheriff Davis and his deputies arrived, securing Elias and his remaining men. The battle was over, and the warehouse was theirs as the defenders regrouped. Jack opened the briefcase Elias had been so desperate to protect. Inside were documents, financial records, and communication logs, all pointing to Frontier Consolidated's involvement in the scheme to seize control of Ridge. "This is it," Jack said, holding up the files. "This is the proof we need to take them down." Sheriff Davis nodded. "We'll get this to the right people. They won't be able to hide behind their money anymore." Back at the farm, the team celebrated their victory, though the scars of the battle were still fresh. Clara embraced Jack tightly, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done it, Jack. You've saved us." Jack shook his head. "We all did. This was about more than the farm. It was about standing up for what's right." As the townspeople gathered to celebrate, Jack stood on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The battle was over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. And Jack Bell was ready for whatever came next. The Bell family farm was quiet the morning after the final confrontation at the warehouse. The crisp air carried a sense of relief and triumph. though the scars of battle were still visible in the broken fences, scattered debris, and exhausted faces of the defenders. For the first time in months, the people of Ridge could breathe a little easier inside the farmhouse. The core team gathered in the kitchen around the evidence they had recovered from Elias Cole's briefcase. The table was covered in documents, financial records, and communication logs, everything they needed to expose Frontier Consolidated's role in the operation. Sheriff Davis sifted through the papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," Davis said, tapping a stack of documents. "This isn't just proof of Elias's connection to Frontier Consolidated. This is a roadmap of their entire operation. Names, accounts, even recordings." Jack Bell stood by the window, his arms crossed. "We need to act fast. If they catch wind of this, they'll bury it before we can use it." Sarah, seated at the table with her rifle leaning against the chair, nodded. "Jack's right. These people have money, lawyers, and connections. We've got the truth, but they'll do everything they can to discredit it." Sheriff Davis straightened, his expression resolute. "Then we go public. This isn't just about the farm or the town anymore. This is about exposing the corruption that let this happen in the first place." By midday, Sheriff Davis was on the phone with contacts at the state level, journalists, legal experts, and trusted officials who could help bring the evidence to light. Meanwhile, Jack and the team worked to ensure the farm remained secure. Though Elias was in custody, his remaining men were still a threat, and Frontier Consolidated wasn't likely to back down quietly. "Think they'll come after us again?" Tommy asked, tightening a bolt on one of the fortified trucks. Jack nodded, his expression grim. "They're cornered, and cornered animals are dangerous. But we've got what we need to finish this." That evening, the first wave of news broke. Local journalists, armed with the documents provided by Sheriff Davis, published exposés detailing Frontier Consolidated's attempts to seize control of Ridge through intimidation, bribery, and violence. Photos of the destroyed quarry, the fortified Bell family farm, and interviews with townspeople painted a vivid picture of resistance and resilience. By the following morning, the story had gone national. Headlines declared the bravery of a small farming community that stood up to corruption, while highlighting the greed and ruthlessness of Frontier Consolidated. Public outrage grew, and calls for accountability echoed across social media and news outlets at the farm. The mood was one of cautious optimism. Clarabelle moved through the kitchen, preparing meals for the defenders who remained. Maggie treated the last of the injuries, while Sarah and Tommy worked to repair the damage to the farm's infrastructure. Jack, standing on the porch, watched as a news van pulled into the driveway. A young reporter stepped out, microphone in hand, her face alight with curiosity and determination. "Mr. Bell," she said, approaching cautiously, "I'm with Channel 7 News. Do you have a moment to speak about what's happened here?" Jack hesitated, his instinct to avoid the spotlight warring with his understanding of the situation. He nodded, stepping down from the porch. "I'll answer what I can." The interview was brief but powerful. Jack spoke about the importance of community, the sacrifices made by the defenders, and the courage of a town that refused to back down. His words resonated, adding to the growing momentum against Frontier Consolidated as the days passed. The pressure on Frontier Consolidated mounted. Legal teams scrambled to respond to the allegations, but the weight of public opinion and the irrefutable evidence proved too much. Executives were forced to resign. Government investigations were launched, and the company's stock plummeted. Elias Cole, now in custody, became a key figure in the unraveling of the conspiracy. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, he agreed to cooperate with investigators, providing further details about Frontier Consolidated's tactics and operations. The victory was bittersweet for the people of Ridge. They had won the battle, but it had come at a cost. Homes and businesses needed rebuilding, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But the town was united as never before, its people bound by the shared experience of standing together against a powerful foe. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the core team gathered on the porch of the farmhouse. The air was cool, and the sky was painted with hues of orange and purple. Clara, seated in her rocking chair, looked out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. "You've done something remarkable, Jack," she said softly. "Not just for the farm, but for this whole town." Jack, leaning against the railing, smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me, Grandma. Everyone played their part." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. "Even so, you gave them hope, and that's something no one can take away." The group sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. Though the fight was over, the lessons they had learned and the bonds they had forged would endure in the days that followed. The farm became a symbol of resilience and resistance. People came from across the region to offer their support, inspired by the story of a small town that stood up to corruption and won. The Bell family farm, once a quiet piece of land, was now a beacon of hope, and though the battle was over, Jack Bell knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was never truly done. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, surrounded by the people who had made it all possible. As Alpha rested at his feet, Jack looked out at the farm, a sense of pride and gratitude swelling in his chest. They had defended their home, they had defended their future, and they had won. The days after the victory at the warehouse were a whirlwind of activity for the town of Redridge. The story of their resistance had reached far and wide, drawing attention from journalists, activists, and even government officials. But amid the chaos of newfound recognition, the real work began. Rebuilding trust and repairing what had been broken. Jack Bell spent his mornings at the farm, overseeing the repairs to the land and the fences. The battle had left scars, literal and figurative, but there was a determination in every swing of the hammer and every shovel of dirt. The townspeople, once divided by fear and doubt, worked together as a single, unified force. Sarah, her rifle now resting on a rack in the barn, had taken on the role of trainer for the community. With the threat of frontier consolidated diminished, she taught the townsfolk defensive strategies and survival skills. Her sessions, held in the open fields of the farm, drew participants of all ages. Even Clara joined in, though she mostly offered advice and moral support from the sidelines. Maggie, ever the caregiver, turned her focus to the emotional wounds the town had suffered. She set up weekly gatherings in the church, where people could talk openly about their fears and experiences. At first, the sessions were quiet, with most hesitant to speak, but over time, the shared stories brought the community closer together. Sheriff Davis took on a more visible role, patrolling the streets and holding town hall meetings. He made it clear that Redridge would no longer tolerate intimidation or corruption. With Jack's help, he organized a council of local leaders to ensure the community had a voice in its own future. Jack, however, carried a quiet weight. The victory had come at a cost, and while the immediate danger was gone, he knew the fight wasn't entirely over. He spent his evenings walking the perimeter of the farm, Alpha at his side, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. One evening, as Jack walked the fields, Clara joined him, her steps steady despite her age. She carried a lantern, its soft glow illuminating the path ahead. "You've done a lot for this town, Jack," she said, her voice warm but firm. "But you can't carry all of it on your shoulders." Jack sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It doesn't feel like enough, Grandma. There's still so much to fix." Clara stopped, placing a hand on his arm. "You gave them hope. You gave them a reason to fight. That's more than enough." Jack looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. "Maybe, but there's still more I can do." Clara smiled softly. "You always were stubborn. Just remember, you're not alone in this." The next morning, Jack gathered the townspeople at the square. He spoke of the work still to be done, not just rebuilding homes and businesses, but rebuilding trust and resilience. He reminded them that their strength came from unity and that their story was proof that even the smallest communities could stand against the greatest odds. By the end of the day, the town was buzzing with purpose. Volunteers worked to clear debris, repair damaged buildings, and plant new crops. Children played in the fields, their laughter a reminder of what they had fought to protect. For the first time in months, Redridge felt alive again, and while there were still challenges ahead, the people knew they could face them. Together, the momentum of rebuilding swept through Reedridge like a fresh wind, breathing life back into a town that had once been paralyzed by fear. The Bell family farm, a symbol of resilience and unity, became the central hub for the efforts. Trucks arrived daily, loaded with tools, lumber, and supplies, donated by neighboring towns inspired by Reedridge's story. Jack Bell was at the heart of it all. He spent his days coordinating teams, dividing tasks, and ensuring that every effort was made with purpose. Whether it was repairing fences, clearing debris from the streets, or replanting fields, Jack was always present, his steady leadership inspiring others to give their all one morning. As the sun rose over the valley, Jack gathered a group of townspeople near the church. A crumpled section of the roof had been damaged during Elias's reign, and the building stood as a reminder of both the town's hardships and its resilience. "Today, we're not just fixing a roof," Jack said, addressing the group. "We're showing everyone what this town is capable of. Piece by piece, we're putting Reedridge back together." The crowd nodded, their resolve clear. Father Miguel stood nearby, his hands clasped as he offered a quiet prayer before the work began. The townspeople climbed ladders, hammered nails, and passed materials to one another with an efficiency born of shared purpose. By the end of the day, the church stood whole once more, its repaired roof gleaming under the evening sun. The townsfolk gathered outside, their faces streaked with sweat and dust but shining with pride. Father Miguel stepped forward, raising his arms. "This building is more than just bricks and wood," he said. "It's a testament to the strength of this community. Together, we've shown that nothing can break us." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the valley. Back at the farm, Clara Bell worked tirelessly to support the efforts, cooking meals for the volunteers and organizing supplies. Though her body was frail, her spirit was unyielding. She took pride in seeing the town rally around her grandson, their unity a reflection of everything she and her late husband had hoped to build one evening. Clara sat with Jack on the porch, their gazes fixed on the horizon. The glow of lanterns from the fields and distant laughter of children filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the town just weeks ago. "You've done something incredible, Jack," Clara said, her voice tinged with emotion. "This town isn't just surviving, it's thriving." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just me, Grandma." Everyone stepped up. "They're the ones making this happen." Clara smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe, but they needed someone to show them the way. And that someone was you." In the weeks that followed, the transformation of Reedridge continued. Businesses reopened, crops were replanted, and families returned to their homes with a renewed sense of hope. Sheriff Davis worked with Jack to establish a community watch, ensuring that the town would never again fall victim to outside threats. One afternoon, a group of children approached Jack, their faces bright with curiosity. Among them was Tommy Jr., the boy who had declared Jack a hero. He held a handmade banner that read, "Thank you, Jack Bell. We made this for you," Tommy Jr. said, holding the banner up proudly. "For everything you've done for Reedridge." Jack crouched down to meet the boy's gaze, a rare smile breaking through his usual seriousness. "Thanks, kid, but this isn't just for me. This is for all of us." The children beamed, their laughter echoing as they ran off to hang the banner in the town square. As the days turned to weeks, the weight of the past began to lift. The scars left by Elias and his men were still visible, but they were no longer symbols of defeat. Instead, they stood as reminders of what the town had overcome and the strength they had found in unity. For Jack, the work was far from over. He knew that rebuilding a community wasn't just about repairing buildings. It was about fostering trust, hope, and resilience. But as he walked the fields of the farm, Alpha trotting faithfully at his side, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Reedridge was healing, and its future was brighter than ever. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt the stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Peace. The days grew longer as summer settled over Reedridge, the warmth of the season mirroring the renewed spirit of the town. The Bell family farm, once a battleground, was now a hub of life and progress. Every corner of the property reflected the unity that had emerged from adversity: newly mended fences, freshly painted barns, and fields ready for planting. Jack Bell, however, found little time to rest. While the community celebrated its victories and progress, he worked tirelessly to ensure that the town's hard-earned peace endured. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the farm's largest field. Alpha sat beside him, his ears twitching as the faint hum of activity from the farmhouse reached them. Jack's sharp eyes scanned the distant hills, his mind still restless despite the quiet. "You're always thinking, Jack." Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Jack turned to see her approaching, her rifle slung casually over her shoulder. "Old habits," he said with a faint smile. "Can't afford to let my guard down." Sarah stopped beside him, following his gaze. "The town's in good shape. Elias is behind bars. Frontier Consolidated is under investigation, and Ridge is thriving. You've earned a break." Jack sighed, his expression softening. "It doesn't feel over. Not yet. There's still so much to do." Sarah nudged him with her elbow. "It's never really over. But that doesn't mean you can't take a moment to breathe." Later that day, the townspeople gathered at the church for a community meeting. Sheriff Davis had called the assembly to discuss the next steps for Ridge. Now that the immediate threats had been dealt with, the church, newly repaired and filled with light, was packed with residents eager to voice their ideas and concerns. Jack sat near the back, preferring to listen rather than lead this time. Clara, seated beside him, radiated quiet pride. Sheriff Davis stood at the front, his weathered face calm but determined. "We've been through a lot," he began, "but we've come out stronger because we stood together. Now it's time to think about what kind of future we want for Ridge." The discussion ranged from practical matters, road repairs, water management, and farming techniques, to more ambitious ideas, like building a community center or creating a co-op for local farmers. Jack listened intently, his heart swelling with pride at the passion and unity in the room. When the conversation turned to leadership, someone from the crowd called out, "Jack Bell for mayor." Laughter rippled through the room, but the sentiment was genuine. Jack raised a hand, shaking his head with a rare smile. "I think Sheriff Davis has that handled just fine," he said, earning a round of applause. After the meeting, Jack lingered outside the church, leaning against the railing as the townspeople dispersed. Clara joined him, her step steady despite the long day. "They believe in you, Jack," she said softly. "You've given them something to hold on to." Jack glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about me, Grandma. It's about all of us." Clara smiled knowingly. "Maybe, but every movement needs a spark, and you've been that spark for Ridge." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack returned to the farm, the glow of lanterns lighting the way. He found Tommy working on one of the tractors, its engine purring softly as the mechanic fine-tuned its parts. "Looks like she's running smooth," Jack said. Approaching, Tommy wiped his hands on a rack, grinning. "She's ready for anything, just like the rest of us." Jack leaned against the barn door, his gaze distant. "We've come a long way, Tommy, but there's still more to do." Tommy clapped him on the shoulder. "That's why we've got you, Jack. You keep us moving forward." That night, Jack sat on the porch with Alpha at his feet, the stars above twinkling like distant lanterns. The farm was quiet, the faint sound of crickets filling the air. For the first time in weeks, Jack allowed himself to relax, his mind quieting as he watched the fireflies dance in the fields. Clara joined him, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She sat beside him, her presence a calming force. "You've done more than you'll ever admit, Jack," she said softly, "but even you need to rest." Jack smiled faintly, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "I'll rest when it's over." Clara chuckled. "It'll never be over." "Not really, but that's the beauty of it, isn't it? There's always something worth fighting for." Jack nodded, her words settling over him like a warm blanket. The fight wasn't truly over, but for now, he had a moment of peace, a moment to appreciate how far they'd come in that. For Jack Bell was enough. The summer sky stretched endlessly over Ridge, its serene expanse a stark contrast to the stormy months that had preceded it. The Bell family farm, once a battlefield, was now a flourishing beacon of hope. Fields were lush with new crops, and the steady hum of activity carried the promise of a better future. Yet, for Jack Bell, the peace felt transient. Like a brief pause before the next challenge, Jack spent his morning inspecting the farm's perimeter, Alpha trotting faithfully by his side. The defenses they had built were still in place, though much of the danger had passed. Despite the calm, Jack's instincts kept him alert. Years in the Navy SEALs had taught him that complacency was the enemy of survival. As he rounded the edge of the property, Sarah appeared, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "Still patrolling?" she asked, her tone light, but knowing Jack shrugged. "Old habits." Sarah leaned against a fence post, watching him with a faint smile. "You've earned a break, Jack. The town's safe, the farm's thriving, and Frontier Consolidated is in shambles. You've done more than enough." Jack paused, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Maybe, but there's always more to do." Later that afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the farm's driveway, its sleek exterior a stark contrast to the dusty trucks and tractors surrounding it. Jack stepped onto the porch, his expression cautious as a man in a crisp suit climbed out. "Jack Bell?" the man asked, extending a hand. "Name's Agent Wallace. I'm with the Department of Justice." Jack shook the man's hand, his grip firm. "What can I do for you, Agent?" Wallace glanced around, his gaze taking in the farm's renewed vitality. "First, let me say what you and this community have done here is remarkable. You took on a corrupt corporation and won. That's no small feat." Jack crossed his arms, his tone measured. "I'm guessing you're not here just to congratulate us." Wallace nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. We've been digging deeper into Frontier Consolidated's operations, and the more we uncover, the bigger the web gets. This isn't just about Reedridge. It's a nationwide network of corruption, intimidation, and exploitation, and we need someone with your experience to help us finish what you started." Inside the farmhouse, Jack listened as Wallace laid out the details of the investigation. Frontier Consolidated wasn't the only player. Other corporations and individuals were involved, each with their own schemes to exploit small communities across the country. "We're forming a task force," Wallace explained. "We need people who understand what it's like on the ground, people who can think strategically and act decisively. Your background makes you a perfect fit." Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And what happens to Reedridge while I'm off chasing the next fight?" Wallace's tone softened. "From what I've seen, this town doesn't need you to hold its hand anymore. You've given them the tools to stand on their own. But the skills you have, they could help protect countless other towns like this one." That evening, Jack sat on the porch, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Alpha rested at his feet, his calm presence a quiet comfort. Clara joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Jack, her gaze searching his face. "You've got that look again," she said softly. Jack chuckled, though the sound was hollow. "What look?" "The one you had when you told me you were joining the SEALs," Clara said. "Like you're standing at the edge of something big." Jack sipped his tea, the warmth soothing. "Agent Wallace wants me to help take down the rest of Frontier's network. Says it could save a lot of people." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "And you're wondering if it's the right choice?" Jack sighed, leaning back in his chair. "The farm's safe now. The town's rebuilding. Maybe it's time to let go." Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You've always had a calling, Jack. You've never been one to sit still when there's work to be done. But this town, this farm, they'll always be here. And so will I." Jack looked at her, his chest tightening with gratitude. "You're the strongest person I know, Grandma." Clara smiled, her eyes twinkling. "And don't you forget it." The next morning, Jack gathered the core team, Sarah, Tommy, Maggie, and Sheriff Davis, on the porch. He explained the task force's mission and what it could mean for other communities facing threats like Reedridge had. "I won't lie," Jack said. "It's a big decision, and I don't take it lightly. But if this is a chance to make sure no one else goes through what we did, I have to take it." Sarah was the first to speak, her voice steady. "You've done more than enough for this town, Jack. If anyone can take this fight to the next level, it's you." Tommy grinned. "Just don't forget to write." "Yeah? Or at least send a postcard." Maggie nodded. "We'll keep things running here. You do what you need to do." Sheriff Davis extended his hand. "You've got our support. Jack, go make us proud." As Jack packed his truck later that day, the townspeople gathered to see him off. Clara stood at the front of the crowd, her shoulders squared despite the tears in her eyes. "Don't worry, Grandma," Jack said, pulling her into a hug. "I'll be back." "I know you will," Clara said, her voice steady. "You're a belle, and belles always find their way home." With one last wave, Jack climbed into his truck, Alpha jumping into the passenger seat. As the vehicle rolled down the driveway, the crowd cheered, their voices carrying across the fields. Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, the sight of the farm growing smaller with each mile. His heart was heavy, but his resolve was strong. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, Jack felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. And this time, he wasn't just defending a farm. He was fighting for the future. Months passed, and Reedridge flourished in ways no one could have imagined. The scars left by Elias Cole and Frontier Consolidated were fading, replaced by the strength and unity of a community determined to chart its own future. The Bell family farm remained a cornerstone of the town's revival, its fields lush with crops and its fences strong. Yet, despite its outward calm, the absence of Jack Bell was keenly felt. Clara Bell sat on the porch, knitting a quilt with patterns inspired by the seasons of Reedridge: golden wheat for summer, deep green pines for winter, and vibrant wildflowers for spring. She had kept herself busy, pouring her love into the farm and the community. But her thoughts often wandered to her grandson. Letters from Jack arrived sporadically, each one a glimpse into his work with the task force. He described towns like Reedridge, places where corruption and greed had taken root, and how he and his team were dismantling those forces one by one. In every word, Clara felt his sense of purpose, but she also sensed the weight of the battles he fought. One crisp autumn morning, Clara decided to bring the community together for a harvest festival, a tradition her late husband had started decades ago. She sent word through the town, inviting everyone to celebrate how far they'd come and to honor those who had fought for their future. By late afternoon, the farm was alive with activity. Tables were piled high with homemade pies, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. Children played games in the fields, their laughter echoing across the valley. Musicians strummed guitars and fiddles, their melodies filling the air. Sheriff Davis stood near the barn, his weathered face softening as he watched the townsfolk mingle. "You've done a fine thing here, Clara," he said, tipping his hat. "Jack would be proud." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "He'll be back. I know he will." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in golden light, the sound of a truck engine rumbled up the driveway. Heads turned as a familiar vehicle came into view, its outline unmistakable against the fading sky. Clara stood, her hands trembling as the truck came to a stop. The door swung open, and Jack stepped out, his frame silhouetted by the headlights. Alpha leapt down beside him, his tail wagging furiously. "Jack," Clara called, her voice breaking as she rushed toward him. Jack caught her in a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around her frail frame. "I told you I'd be back," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The crowd erupted into cheers, the festival taking on a renewed energy as the townsfolk gathered to welcome Jack home. Children ran up to pet Alpha, while neighbors clapped Jack on the back, their gratitude evident in their smiles. Later that evening, Jack stood on a makeshift stage in the barn. The crowd gathered before him. He looked out at the faces of the people he had fought alongside, the people who had inspired him to keep fighting even when the odds were against them. "This town," Jack began, his voice steady, "is more than a place. It's a testament to what we can accomplish when we stand together. You didn't just survive, you thrived. And you showed the world that even the smallest communities can make the biggest difference." The crowd cheered, their applause filling the barn. "But there's more work to be done," Jack continued, "not just here, but everywhere. Reedridge has become a beacon for others, proof that strength comes from unity, and that no one is powerless when they have something worth fighting for." He paused, his gaze finding Clara in the crowd. My grandmother taught me that legacy isn't just about what you leave behind. It's about what you build while you're here. And this community, is the legacy we've built together. The festival continued late into the night, the farm alive with laughter, music, and joy. Jack sat with Clara on the porch, watching the lanterns sway in the breeze. The distant sound of the fiddle carried through the air, a reminder of the life they had fought so hard to protect. "You're staying this time, aren't you?" Clara asked. Her tone half-teasing. Jack smiled, his gaze thoughtful. "For a while. There's still work to do out there, but I think it's time I spent some time here. With you. With the farm." Clara reached over, placing a hand on his. "This is your home, Jack. No matter where you go, it always will be." Jack nodded, his heart full. The road ahead was uncertain, but for now, he was exactly where he needed to be. Home the next morning, as the first rays of sunlight bathed the farm, Jack stood in the fields, Alpha at his side. The land stretched out before him, vibrant and alive, a testament to everything they had overcome for Jack Bell. The fight for justice would never truly be over. But standing there, surrounded by the community he had helped save, he felt a deep sense of peace, a knowledge that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, Ridge would endure. And so, with the farm thriving and the town united, Jack turned his gaze to the horizon, ready for whatever came next. For this was his legacy, a life dedicated to protecting what mattered most and inspiring others to do the same. Join our journey of growth, inspiration, and empowerment by subscribing to our channel. Together, let's create a community that stands tall, lifts others, and makes the world a better place, one story at a time. We'd love for you to be part of our family.